A pastor and a priest walk into a movie theater. Hi, I'm Father Andrew Miller.
And I'm Reverend Michelle Byerly.
And this is A Pastor and a Priest Walk Into a Movie Theater, a podcast about faith, life, and the silver screen. Today we'll be discussing the 1990 drama film Avalon.
And again, for those of you who have not seen it, as always, we recommend that you check it out and watch it first, as we will be getting into spoilers and discussions. So we are excited to have you on this conversation today.
So this film is the story of a secular Jewish family who it depicts three generations of them sort of living under one roof, and it's after the first generation of them has come to America. It has some very interesting things to say, I think, about the idea of the American dream as we define it. But it opens with the main character, Sam, who is sort of the patriarch of this semi-nuclear family, and then we can get into how the family unit kind of breaks down and how the film plays with the idea of what constitutes a family. But Sam telling the story about how he came to America. I came to America in 1914, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It really is a very neat scene when he first arrives in Baltimore, Maryland, on the 4th of July. And his entire it really frames and bookends the movie, this image of America in the middle of a celebration and in the middle of the fireworks and joy. And I wish our country were like that all the time.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's part of what we talk about too. Again, like you said, what is the American dream? Who has access? Who doesn't? How do we access it?
Indeed.
But yeah, he is telling this story, and he tells it a few times. And so I guess that's kind of where I want to start. Is one of the major themes of this movie is the oral tradition and the telling of stories and retelling, and how stories are shared in community together. And I think that's very quintessentially, we know that the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the writings, the prophets, they were handed down first and foremost as oral tradition first. And they were cultures that were used to sitting down and listening to one another. And we have since transitioned from a culture of oral listening and transmitting to now a literary culture. And I almost wonder if we're almost at a point where there will be a new phase, and I'm trying to figure out what that's going to be. Maybe a visual culture. So much of things is committed through or transmitted through television, movies, which is another part of the film as well.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that there is so much that one can do with that, because especially from the biblical perspective, I think we in 21st century society, and well, this has been true for many centuries now, have really underestimate the just how central the idea of oral culture is to the Bible. There's a book that I'm looking for right now that I'm gonna pull up here in just a second, if you'll but I really have to recommend this book. I'm sorry, Michelle. I didn't know I was
Well, and I'll give an example as you're looking. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." And he is teaching in the synagogues, and he is speaking and hearing, and he tells stories as well to teach. That is his method. And so, part of that overall question then is, what is our story, and who gets to tell the story?
Yeah, no, and there's a book that I would recommend to the listener. It's written from an evangelical Christian perspective. Leans a little heavy onto inerrancy, but it does frame the idea of biblical inerrancy, and it's called "The Lost World of Scripture: Ancient Literary Culture and Biblical Authority" by John H. Walton and D. Brent Sandy. And it's absolutely brilliant, because what it does is it really recovers a sense in which the oral culture of the biblical communities was just so central to how the Bible is written, and even the fact that it is written and for what purpose it is written and that sort of thing. So for instance, people could memorize things very easily back then by hearing them. Like for instance, there's a tradition, a legend that goes that in order to study at the feet of Gamaliel, you had to memorize the Tanakh. St. Paul, who studied at the feet of Gamaliel, therefore would have had to have memorized the Tanakh. And we hear then go, oh my God, that's really impressive. Actually, back then it wouldn't have been that impressive, because they hear things and remember them. The mind at the time was trained to be able to hear things and remember it. So they could remember lists of things far better than we could, because they were trained to hear things. And so remembering the story and remembering the details of the story was something that they were far better at than we were. On the other hand, we do begin to see a little bit in the film this idea of how much do the details really matter, because they start.
And I was going to say that, yeah.
Yes.
Because then, it doesn't necessarily matter if someone wore a blue coat or a red coat. It's just that they were there, for example. I'm just making up an example there, but, and even if one person forgets the detail, the value of community is to say, I don't remember it that way.
And they do that in the film at the table. I think the Thanksgiving dinner that the film depicts, they're telling stories about all of their elders who came to the United States, and they start talking in a kind of jovial way. They're not arguing, but they're sort of jovially saying, as you said, I don't remember it that way. Oh yeah, I don't think it went down like that. And it's so interesting that in cultures that are based on oral storytelling, there's a sense in which, on the one hand, folks could remember details far more easily than we could, where because we write them down so we don't have to remember them. Whereas on the other hand, the way history was written in the first century of the Common Era was very different than the way history is written now. So for instance, when professional historians do history, they're trying to get the details as right as they possibly can. There's a little more to it than that, but that would not have been true of, say, the authors of the Gospels or the authors of the Chronicles. In doing history, they're not as interested in getting the details of what exactly happened 100% accurate, but in telling a story. And that is so crucial in understanding how the Bible was written.
Yeah. Because then that lends again to that question of who tells the story.
Yes.
What perspective? Who gets to control the narrative? And this is true whether you're speaking aloud or whether you're writing it down. The fact is that every story is told from a particular perspective, and that perspective is a decision, and it shapes how you view the world.
And our identity comes through stories, and that's post-liberal narrative theology right there. And indeed, what religion is, it is the living out of stories, the decision to live out certain stories as opposed to other stories. So, for instance, you take a story of, as we record this, it's Holy Saturday. It's just about to I'm just about to celebrate the Easter Vigil, and I think of the arguments over the historicity of the resurrection. And I think that, I do believe that the resurrection of Jesus was indeed an historical event, and that it actually happened. If you could hop inside a TARDIS, Doctor Who reference, and go all the way back to the moment at which it happened, you'd see it happen. On the other hand, that is of secondary importance to the fact that the story is lived. How do you live the resurrection of Jesus? And you can say that about any story in the Bible. At the end of the day, and it's not just the Bible, it's any piece of religious doctrine. At the end of the day, what story do you choose to live out? And furthermore, the idea of religion as community, as the stories that shape a particular community, indeed a family. The church is supposed to be a family, and we're supposed to have these deep and brotherly, sisterly, interpersonal relationships with one another. Obviously, we don't. The church is an institution. But imagine the idea of reading the Bible instead of reading the Bible as so formally. Instead, the reading of the Bible becomes a kind of sharing of stories as the Krasinskis do in the film of, oh yeah. They're the stories that shape us, that give us our identity, and we sit around the table and we reminisce about them and we make meaning from them and we choose to live them out.
And then that gives us permission to retell the story if we need to, which gets back to the American story for me. Until and unless we come to terms with the fact that ours is a story of conquer and trafficking, that we can't have an identity of meaning and purpose. That we have to come to terms with that. We don't know ourselves if we don't tell that story. And so, what stories do we tell? What family stories do we never talk about?
Well, and in the Bible, the use of the Bible, I think the church needs to be conscious as well of telling the texts of terror, the aspects of the Bible that depict God as ordering genocide, and needs to understand that that is a part of our identity, whether for better, for worse, and for better. And unfortunately, it has been used and abused in such a way as to assert that the ordering of genocide and the ordering of violence is something that God would actually do. And so as a result, Christians have historically been very violent and very domineering and very oppressive, much as Americans have been historically very violent and very domineering and very oppressive. I think part of that has to do with the fact that we don't know what to do with these stories. We don't know what to do with the story of slavery. And so we live into it in an unhealthy way. The idea of the Thanksgiving meal, and the film is really bookended by two Thanksgiving meals. The first one, which was really a beautiful scene, and then the next one, the next Thanksgiving meal that's depicted is doesn't work out so well, and we can get into that in a minute. But I did want to talk about the idea of Thanksgiving as a worshipful moment. In at least traditional Christian worship, it's broken in the liturgy. The worship service is broken into two basic parts. There's the liturgy of the word and the liturgy of the sacrament, right? The liturgy of the word, meaning where we tell the story and we expound upon the story. We would know it as the sermon and the readings and the initial prayers and that sort of thing. And of course, and then there's the liturgy of the sacrament, which is the communion, right? Well, if you break it down, everything that's going on at this table, at this Thanksgiving meal, is exactly what happens in a worship service. And furthermore, the word Eucharist means Thanksgiving. And we treat it as a ritual. And it is a ritual. But on the other hand, it's also a meal and a sharing. And unfortunately, the church has become so institutionalized that we don't see it that way.
Well, and what's so interesting to me is how they respond to it, right? Because they're new to it. They don't understand it fully. They adopt it. And I think sometimes that happens. It's sort of like you say, we've become so distanced from the origins of the Eucharist, from what it means, that we're trying to, like, there's a lot of explaining that has to happen and making meaning of it, for people to understand it. And we do kind of twist ourselves into so many contortions to explain what's going on with it.
Yeah, no, and as the Krasinskis, what I think you mean when you say they've adopted this practice, they've adopted Thanksgiving dinner. Now there are other
correct
communal meals that their culture would have that would function very similarly. But yeah, and it is funny how they explain the origin to their relatives that had just come from Europe. This takes place. The story takes place after World War II in the early 1950s. And part of the story is that a small family of relatives whom they've never met is coming to the United States after having spent time in a concentration camp, and then in a refugee camp after the war, and now they're coming to the United States, and they're having to explain to these folks what the Thanksgiving meal is. And it's really interesting how they very nonchalantly explain. I don't even remember the language they use, but it's sort of like, oh, a bunch of pilgrims. I don't even know who they were.
Right.
And I thought that was great, because it really takes the idea of Thanksgiving, the idea of sharing meal, and universalizes it. It's the meal, the sharing that counts. At the end of the day, the pilgrims and the mythology that we build up around the harvest Thanksgiving meal in this country is of secondary importance, although not unimportant.
Yeah. And it gets into another major theme is the immigrant story.
Yes.
And how, we start with the first one who came in like 1917, and now they're working on bringing other family members, and they have a big vote about that process in a collection. And it's always interesting, that process of that first generation is so into rah America, and then the second generation is trying to also make sense of it. By the third generation, you start being a little more critical of what has been, and you also look for your roots that have been set aside in that element of the rah America.
Yeah, it's interesting. The way this film tells the immigrant story, as if there were only one immigrant story,
Right.
The way this film tells that story is different than another film that tells the immigrant story, which is, say, The Godfather, which tells it in a much more dark, it takes a much more dark and dim view of the immigrant experience in the United States, at least on the surface, because it seems shakes a very dark and dim view of the immigrant experience, at least on the surface of it. Whereas this film, at least on the surface of it, seems to be very positive. He comes to America in 1914, and his experience of it is celebratory. He finally finds his brothers, and they're waving to him joyfully. And he tells the story of coming to this country as if it was just such a joy for him, which contrasts that to the story of the Corleones or the Antolinis in The Godfather, and how the experience of alienation that occurred in that story led them to, well, a life of crime. But what's so interesting is that actually, I don't think that this film is as celebratory and as Americana as it seems to be at first glance, because I think the film
I would agree.
Yeah, the film takes that apart very carefully, or very, very subtly, because, well, I think on the one hand, what America does to them, and it's so interesting that this film is set in the 1950s, at the birth and perhaps golden age of television, is it shows how things like television, and we have today have very similar arguments over things like social media and other electronic media, how things like television facilitate the breakdown of these communities. And it's so interesting how you go from having in the course of this film, you go from having a very, very strong, connected family that of these four brothers and their wives and their children, all living in the same row in Baltimore. And in the course of the story, the Sam and his family, Sam's one of the four brothers, leaves leaves Baltimore, leaves Avalon, and moves out to the suburbs. And that's sort of the plot of the film. It's about moving out to the suburbs in the 1950s, and yet it's sort of that sort of represents a kind of gradual breakdown in this community that happens, right? So you have this massive non-nuclear family that breaks down into a 2-generation family with Sam and the grandparents and Sam's son, whose name I can't remember, and their child Michael, through whose eyes most of the story takes place, right? So that now they're living in a 2-generation home, cut off from the rest of their family. And then finally, Sam's daughter-in-law can't stand her mother-in-law, and so they insist upon Sam and her moving out, and she's about to have another baby, and you get the nuclear family that we're all so familiar with. And oh, by the way, notice how television functions in the film, to where you start off with this Thanksgiving meal where they're sharing stories, and then you come back to the meal in the smaller units, and what are they doing? They're all watching TV. They've got the TV set up while they're sitting around the meal, and they're just living life through the TV. And it's the film does such a great job in showing just how depressed they look.
To the point that they will also just watch the dead air time.
Yes.
Waiting for something to happen.
Yes. People gathering around watching test patterns. That actually happened, by the way.
And by the way, to our Generation Z and beyond listeners, there was a time when TV actually went off the air.
Well, and there was,
and even to the millennials, we don't remember that so much. Yeah.
Actually, there were stations in Kansas City when I was in kindergarten that would go off the air.
Yeah.
That
so I mean, and I remember where if you were going to watch something, you had to watch it at a certain time.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have recording or some of those things. But yeah, so it definitely does have that critique of how technology impacts the ability to connect with one another and to be a family. And like I said, I think you can either view it as a breakdown, or is it the birth of a new medium through which we will eventually transmit knowledge and information?
That is a good question, and one which I think the film leaves unresolved, because there are problems, and it's not just television, it's the breakdown of the family itself. So for instance, it's what leads to one of the final blows to family unity occurs at the aforementioned second Thanksgiving meal.
You cut the turkey without me.
Yes. No. So yeah.
But you took forever to come out here because you wanted to be fashionably late.
Exactly. One of the 4 brothers, Gabriel. So they live in the suburbs. It takes a while to commute from Baltimore to get to where they're hosting this meal out in the suburbs. But one of the 4 brothers, Gabriel, is making the trip out to the Thanksgiving meal, and they're trying to wait for him, but he's late, and the children are hungry, and so they decide, all right, we're going to start eating. And sucks to be Gabriel. Well, Gabriel gets there, and he's upset, and he, I would say, overreacts and stomps out of the dinner, and just they never reconcile. Indeed, Sam and Gabriel are like, Gabriel does not come to Sam's wife's funeral. They never talk to each other again. They have a little bit of a scene at one of the family circles, but there's another interesting bit at that family circle. That's where Sam resigns as sort of the president of the family. We can get into this idea of the institutionalization of the family.
Yes,
but back to the breakdown. No. Showing late. There are people out there who intentionally show up late to things, and I get the impression that's what Gabriel does. Like, he intentionally shows up late to things, there's.
And I think part of it too is he's still living in the city. They've moved out to the suburbs, and I think there's a little bit of he doesn't like that they've left the city. And that's part of creating the distance. And so he's saying one of his arguments is, well, if you wouldn't have moved all the way out here, it wouldn't take me so long to come.
Although he comes late all the time, because in the previous Thanksgiving scene, he was late there too, and they waited for him. And what's interesting is that he also he's the brother who's always directing things.
Yeah,
right? There's
it's
a
a
joke
power.
about There's a joke about him. He's the one who doesn't do any of the work. He just tells the others how to do work when they were working as paper hangers. There are people who show up late as sort of a power move, and that's how I read Gabriel's character. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, and to me, they're right to call him on his bullshit. And yet it is precisely the calling of him on his bullshit that leads to the breaking down of the family, right? And so the question that I have, that I think the film leaves really unresolved, is that, is this breaking down a good thing ultimately, or a bad thing? Is it acceptable to put up with a little bit of bullshit in order to keep a family together, or do we embrace the breakdown of the I thou identity that really, and the individualization that really occurs in the wake of this breakdown of the family? I love the scene where Elijah Wood's character, the child Michael, is looking out the back of the car as they're driving away from that last family circle meeting, and there's a great sadness in his gaze as he realizes probably the last time I'll ever come to Avalon. And indeed it is. And it seems to me that there's a dialectical tension in the film between, on the one hand, calling people on their bullshit and accepting the consequences of that, versus, on the other hand, accepting a little bit of bullshit in order to keep something good together, the family.
Well, and that's a big family systems debate, right? Because we know that when one person in a system changes or stands up and calls out the bullshit, that then there is pushback in the system, because the system wants to maintain homeostasis. It wants to keep things the way that they are and were, and change isn't, it doesn't, we don't like change all that much.
Yeah, and on the other hand, so there are definite problems that come along from the breakdown of the family. By the way, the last breakdown of the family, I think, is after the fire, and we can get into what the fire was. When he turns to, when his brother, the Sam's son, starts a retail business with his brother, and it burns down. And there's huge symbolism in that moment. But Sam's nephew, who the co-owner of this business, is like, all right, well, let's file for bankruptcy. We'll regroup. We'll start again. We'll be fine. And Sam's son says, I can't do it anymore. I just cannot. And so now they don't break up on friendly terms. They remain brothers and they remain friendly with each other, but they're no longer a pair. They're no longer working together. They were always together in the course of the film until that moment. And so there's that final breakdown. But it seems to me there are definite problems associated with the breaking down of these institutions and of these families. Are the problems that come along with that better or worse than the problems that come along with putting up with some bullshit? And I don't know. I don't think
And I want
the
to
film
be
knows.
and I want to be clear that when we talk about putting up with stuff, we are not talking about emotional,
Abuse.
physical abuse. Yeah. To me, tear that down like none other.
Fuck yeah.
Break that system.
Yes.
But, we all have our quirks. We all have our dysfunctions. And so there is some point at which being in relationship is an opportunity to have a good impact on one another. From a sociological perspective, family developed for a reason. Now, what that family looks like has changed over time, because I don't even think we ever really had the Ward and June Cleaver nuclear family. That has hardly existed. We think we tell that story, but that's not how it has been, and that's not how it is in most cultures.
And even in our culture, that is really a very post World War II. It didn't really become the norm until after World War II. So it's only about 70 years old as the norm. I mean, but it's only been the norm. It's only been the most common way of experiencing family in our culture for about 70 to 80 years. But
and now it seems to be going away again, because it is a lot harder. I want to talk about the economics of, living in the midst of the city, and then you have this white flight out into the suburbs.
That's another good point.
And I want to, and it comes back to the American dream. And if you're ready to go there, I do want to talk about the symbolism of the fire in that regard. And for me, it is the loss of the American dream, that this ideal that you came for and had has now literally gone up in smoke.
And gone up in smoke. It's interesting. There's a scene where all right, so they buy this huge warehouse store. They're sort of the pioneers of Walmart, right? They buy this huge warehouse store with lots and lots of merchandise, and they have this massive opening sale, and they make lots and lots of money off of it. And the very same day, the store goes up in flames. Now, the child thinks that he did it, that he's responsible for the burning down of the store. And he thinks this because he was playing with fire, which he shouldn't have been doing, and he thought he had put it out, and maybe not. And then there's this encounter in which his father tells him, nah, they said the fire marshal said that the fire began on the 4th floor. And you find yourself as an audience sort of wondering, is his father telling him that so he doesn't carry the guilt of it? Or is that true? Well, I actually happen to think it's true. I actually think that his father is not lying in that moment, because I think what that does with the story is it demonstrates the randomness that can cause the destruction of the American dream. That we all, what is the American dream? That we work hard and we, get ahead, whatever getting ahead means, and we
we succeed and we become really rich.
Out of our
pull
own merit.
Ourselves up by our bootstraps. Never mind that how many people brought us over, how many people have supported us.
Well, that and even if we work really, really hard, this is nothing. There's no guarantee that a fire isn't going to jump up and destroy everything. I mean, this idea of the American dream is so fickle, because it. Well, George Carlin, one of my favorite comedians, said this of the American dream. They call it the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it.
Yep.
And I think it's bullshit. I at least the American dream to me is the idea of community and well, finding ourselves in the face of the other. And I will say that in that moment, there are 2 instances where I think that I found very redemptive. The first was in Sam. They don't know that Michael's innocent yet. They don't know that the fire wasn't started by Michael, but the way Sam handles his grandson telling him, I ruined my family. I burned down my father's store. He doesn't berate him. He doesn't shame him. He just he responds to that with great compassion and says, you have to tell your father. You have to say that, but he's so gentle about it. And then his father, who responds with compassion. So on the other, and that speaks again. We talk about the breakdown of the family, and you mentioned how, or is it a breakdown or is it something new? And I wonder. All right, so. You have a thesis, which is this institutionalized family unit symbolized in 2 things. One, the family circle meetings, which we still need to talk to, and then the Thanksgiving dinners. And then you have the antithesis, which is the suburbs, the white flight, the moving out to the suburbs, that sort of thing. And then I wonder if they're not getting at a new synthesis, which is, all right, so refusing to put up with bullshit breaks down family systems. But it also perhaps opens the door to building new ones and new, more authentic ones, which speaks, I think, to, for instance, the breakdown of the church, the fact that fewer and fewer people are going to church. Well, my response to that is that's a good thing, because it opens the door for church to become something new and more authentic. Okay, I've talked for a long time. I'll shut up now.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And now there's a lot of new things that are coming. There's what we call fresh expressions, which is a movement that is trying to find what are called third places. So places that people spend time that aren't their home or work. And then there's this new concept also of micro churches, especially post-pandemic, which I would call, going back to the history of the early church, home churches, gathering in those places. And so I think there's value to that. And we talked, and it kind of goes back to this theme of the Thanksgiving as worship and as Eucharist. I once had a parishioner who said that they had gone on a marriage retreat, and they said that family is like a church in itself, and for me, one of the new things that I think, one of the emphasis that is coming out, it should have always been, but it's becoming more critical and vital, is how do we equip people to take worship into their home spaces, into where they are. If we can't get people to come to church, how can we send it to the world?
I had a suggestion that I was called a heretic for in old Catholic circles, and I'm not necessarily recommending this, but wouldn't it be interesting if at every meeting or at every meal, every family meal, the father or mother stands up at the beginning of the meal and says, on the night in which he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread, and after he had given thanks, he blessed it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body which is broken." In other words, we turn our family meal into a Eucharist. Now, from a Catholic perspective, that is hella problematic. But
Andrew, what about the priestly role?
Well, it's not just that. It's what do you do with all the crumbs? Like, are we consecrating the turkey as well? There are just so many different, and part of me, the Protestant in me, wants to go, that's all bullshit and it's all minutia and it's all. But on the other hand, well, I'm a Catholic and I can't get away from that.
Welcome to your mid-reel episode of A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater as we talk about Avalon. You'll notice, first of all, that it is not editor Wesley today, it's editor Michelle. I'm here with Wesley as I'm practicing editing skills and getting good at this. So if there is an editing style that you're noticing and different, help us get feedback on how we can improve our quality and content. And speaking of improving our quality and content, we really want to hear from you on our forum website. Would you please do us a favor and engage with us? Let us know what your thoughts are on these episodes, possible future ideas, and share in the word of mouth with your friends about A Pastor and a Priest and all of the New Faith, New Media podcasts. That is one way you can support us. Another way you can support us is through backing it with your finances. We have a couple of opportunities on our website, newfaithnewmedia.net, to do that by becoming a patron on our Patreon account or by giving through Give Me a Coffee.
Buy me a coffee.
Buy me a coffee. See, I'm learning new things here. But we are so grateful for all the ways that you support our work, and we are thankful for each of you who make this podcast a reality. We do it for you, and so if we can make it better, help us to do that. And so with that, we will return to our regularly scheduled episode of A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater.
Yeah. Which is really interesting because, I had Maundy Thursday dinner on Thursday night, and we did a potluck, and towards the end we had elements that had been sitting on the table, but it is an interesting point. Did everything then become consecrated or not? I'm going to go with the fact, does it matter? It matters, but what's important is the sharing and the fellowship together. That is where the true communion happens. And to me, that is why I do bemoan the loss of the family dinner as such. It seems like today people are so busy that everyone's running here, there, and everywhere. and it's harder to get people to gather and sit down together and talk about how was your day, what's going on, and to build those connections with one another.
Yeah, and it's interesting though that there are two. There's a lot of dialectical tension in the film, but there's the Thanksgiving and there's the family circle. I've never
okay. Let's talk about the family circle.
I've never encountered a family parliament. Like that is so the Krasinskis have what is effectively a family parliament. Like and they even use parliamentary procedures. They elect a president. They vote. They have they keep precedence for speakers. It's amazing. I've never encountered anything like that.
Yeah, that was a new one on me. I mean, and I think about that. I think what's so funny to me is if I were to think of a family doing that, I would think it would be someone like the Corleones having that kind of structure where you have the boss and the people that serve under. And yeah, and it is so interesting that they do have that very formalized structure of the family meeting, as it were. And it makes me kind of think of like the church council meeting.
What if the one way of reframing how the story plays out is instead of the breakdown of the Krasinski family taking place over Thanksgiving, it took place over family circle, because and that's what happened really. The last when Sam stormed, and it's interesting how Gabriel storms out of Thanksgiving dinner, pox upon him, but Sam storms out of the family circle, and I think he storms out of the family circle because he realizes that his brother's being a jerk to him. He didn't have to take it anymore. And what's so interesting is I wonder if it's not a breakdown of family per se, it's a breakdown of institution.
I would agree that it's more about the institution. And I want to also talk about another factor in all of that, with the names. There was the conversation around, as they're forming the business, Sam sees these two brothers or cousins, and one has changed their name to Kay and one has changed it to Kirk, I think, or something.
Sam's son, Jules Krasinski, has become Jules Kay, and Sam's nephew, Izzy Krasinski, has become Izzy Kirk. And they do this for the sake of being accepted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think about this a lot in terms of name and identity. And he says, what kind of family is this? And that is actually a very strong argument for, and please hear me out on this, dear listener. There is an argument that is often that I've seen made in certain circles about why it's important to have the woman take the husband's last name. And that it's because they're becoming one family unit. Now, I think there's other ways to do it, but it's an interesting conversation around how much our name and our identity do matter, and yes, it very much, to be that reason for why they change it is important too, of being accepted. And it kind of makes me think about my name. My last name is kind of an interesting one. It's Byerly, which, I get all sorts of pronunciations on it. And I'm not 100% sure. I'm fairly sure it's German, but it could also, there is an English place name that traces back to that as well. So it's just interesting, this conversation that we have around names. And I've always kind of said, it will be interesting to have that conversation if I were to ever have a future spouse, to have that conversation and say, okay, am I going to change my name? Are we going to create a new one together? How are we gonna do that?
It's forcing the vulnerable to change their names. But we do that both in marriage and in the case of what these two cousins are doing. Yeah. Because these two cousins change their names in order to be accepted in Protestant American life, because Krasinski is a Russian Jewish name, and it's just not acceptable to the people around them. Coming from a Russian Jewish background, they are of a vulnerable class of people. historically oppressed and marginalized class of persons, forcing to assimilate in order to have an American dream that will eventually blow up in their faces anyways. And in marriage, it's the woman who
becomes property of the husband.
Yeah.
It's truly a property issue.
She changes her identity to suit his needs.
Yeah. And so it it's that old quote from Romeo and Juliet. And I know there's more context to this than that, but what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Well, there's quite a lot of identity that's carried there.
Yeah.
It means something to be a Capulet. It means something to be a Montague.
This what's in a name? A lot. And this speaks, I think, to one of the most basic doctrines of Christianity. And if I were to critique us, go off on a tangent for a minute, we're taking this story about a Jewish family, and we're finding an awful lot of Christianity. A Jewish family made by Barry Levinson, a Jewish man. This film that is made specifically about Jews about Jewish persons by Jewish persons, and we're turning it very, very much so into a Christian story, which pox upon us for doing it.
That's fair.
Okay, the idea of, well, I mean, how does God create? She speaks creation into existence. It's the creation through the use of language, right? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he said, "Let there be light," and there was light, right? And it's sort of this sense in which language is the means by which we give order to what would otherwise be a jumble in our minds. And carry that another step further, and we've come full circle. That it is the story that gives us our identity, that provides a kind of order to our status as a family, as a unit, as a church, right? And there's this question. It's a very, very good question when they're arguing over the details. On the one hand, I think it expresses how remembering the details exactly right isn't that important, but on the other hand, is it? Though, is it not that important? Because one of them asks, well, if we don't, he puts it in sort of a kind of silly way, if I don't remember, how can I remember? Or something really, really silly like that. Like, well, if I start to forget the details, how can I remember the details? Right. And I think the meaning in that is, well, if we start to fudge on the details, then
Well, and that gets into an interesting concept of the anamnesis, which is tied with the Eucharist, and that's the word for remember. Mm-hmm. Amnesia is when we forget, and so telling stories is about remembering.
The anamnesis. So the Eucharist, dear listener, has really the consecration of the Eucharist has two parts. There's what Pastor Michelle said of anamnesis, which is the words of institution. The night in which he was betrayed, our Lord Jesus took bread into his holy and blameless hands, and this is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Right, that's the anamnesis. There's also the epiclesis, which is the invocation of the Holy Spirit to transform the elements into something that is sacred. For me, the literal body and blood of Christ. For other Christians, something more symbolic. But either way, thought I defined the term. Sorry.
Yeah, and even, and again, forgive me if I'm speaking of that which I do not know, but since we're talking about trying to remember that this is a Jewish story, the Passover meal started as, remember you were strangers in the land of Egypt, and God has brought you forth to the promised land.
Why is this night different than any other
night?
Because once we were slaves, and now we were slaves no more.
Yeah. So, and I think we have to be very careful as Christians when talking about that relationship between the Passover and the Eucharist. And yet there is, again, that element of part of it is intentional, like you are supposed to have a young child there that you tell the story to pass it down to the next generation. You tell the story of the of God's work in freeing being freed from the land of Egypt. There's the table that has very specific things that are sat around it that tell the story.
Exactly. And one of the things that really pisses me off, and I got into you come to the prison ministry with me once at the Bethany group. I got into trouble with Bethany group because Bethany group holds a Passover Seder, or not a Passover Seder. They hold a Seder, a Christian Seder, and Christian Seders piss me off. They just piss me off.
I had a few congregation members who called what we did the other night Seder. I'm like, no. I'm very clear that this is not, because our Jewish brothers and sisters have asked us not to call it that.
Correct.
And not to do that.
Because
yeah. And so I was just going to say, so you were saying with your group, they called it that.
No, they did it very intentionally. They took a Haggadah, and they one of the Jewish books for having the Passover meal, and they Christianized it and did a Christian Seder. And they asked me why I didn't come, and I told them flat out, I don't think you should do this. And they were pissed at me that night. But in any case, it's like it's cultural appropriation, and it's taking the culture of an historically oppressed people, the Jews, Jewish persons, and taking it over and making it one of our own. It's no different than if we were to go and hold our own sweat lodge. It's horrid.
So
on the other hand, well, I suppose talking about and it's interesting. Avalon is the third in a series of movies that Barry Levinson made about a Jewish community in Baltimore. They're not sequels to each other. They take place and they're entirely independent of each other. But the first one is called Diner, and the second one is called Tin Men, and then there's Avalon, and it's a series of films that this Jewish director made about the Jewish community in Baltimore, Maryland. And it's interesting. I say it that way because this is a Jewish story in the truest sense of the term. It's not only a story about Jewish people, it is a story made by Jewish people, made for Jewish people. And yet here we are, two Christians.
Fair.
I think we should still make the podcast and throw it out there, because I think we've said some things that are meaningful and
I think and I hope that we've been sensitive to make meaning of it and to say that we can value it as it is.
Dr. Amy Jill Levine, if you're out there listening to us, we welcome your critiques, and please feel free to lambaste the shit out of us. So anyway.
And for our listeners who may not know, Dr. Amy Jill Levine is a Jewish New Testament scholar who has written a number of books. The most well-known that I'm aware of is The Misunderstood Jew, where she talks a lot about how we interpret even the person of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. If I was to have an image of the historical Jesus, it would be the misunderstood Jew. Like Amy Jill Levine, as a non-Christian yet still New Testament scholar, has really helped me to sort of understand who this historical person was, whom I claim to follow.
So if you were to preach about this.
Oh, you're asking the question now.
Yeah, I'm gonna cheat this time and jump the gun. And what would you preach about?
I would preach about the dialectics of families and institutions and the breakdown of the family. And how it sort of goes along with, and we didn't really talk a lot about, I went an entire episode without mentioning Karl Marx. I don't know how I did that, but
wow.
Actually, I just didn't go an entire episode without mentioning Karl Marx, because I just said Karl Marx 3 times now. But anyway.
Is he going to appear now? Karl Marx.
I don't know. Well, you can't see this, dear listener, but I have a portrait of him in my a rather large portrait of him in my house. So, yeah.
Because there is definitely a lot in the movie too about a critique of capitalism and how all of that plays out too. So
I've gone on a lot of tangents in this episode because my thoughts are. And this time I'm very tired, dear listener. I've had a very busy day, and so my thoughts are not exactly germinating well, so mea culpa. But where I was going with this is the in the film, the breakdown of the family, the breakdown of at least the institutional family, and whether or not that's a good or bad thing, really goes along with this and happens parallel to the breakdown of the authentic self in the people who form this family, right? And it's aided along by television. All right, so the early Marx wrote about how human beings should be at home in their work, because our species being is to take nature and change it into other forms of nature. That's what we do. That's our species being. That's what human beings do. And yet, because we have no control over our labor, over the fruits of our labor and that sort of thing, we experience work as alienating. We experience it as strangers in a strange land when we should be most at home in our work, right? And so the result is we react to alienation by finding other means of having a fulfilling life, right? Vicariously, through, say, a God character that we create, right? Through, say, television or beer or drugs, right? And there's a very real sense in which I think that the way in which the family breakdown occurs in the film, as parallel to the individuation of each character as cut off from the greater community, parallel to the alienation and the depression of living such a horrid, unfulfilling life vicariously through television heroes, all occurs together and progresses together, right? And I think I bet I could make a sermon out of that. Probably I'd have to spend a little bit more time to write out my thoughts so they don't come out in such a jumble as they just did, but I think you can make a sermon out of that. I really do. And yeah. So I like how you say the film really is a critique of capitalism. I think that is his reason to tray. I don't know what Barry Levinson's politics are, but the film is very much so a critique of capitalism, and it does so from the perspective of, well, the early existential Marx rather than the later economic Marx.
and I again say that because the American dream all goes up in smoke.
Yes.
At the end. So I think for me, if I were to preach on this, I would talk about the notion of being a stranger in a strange land, and the process of, that those layers of someone coming and then bringing someone behind them, and so on and so forth. And yet somehow we as a culture have kind of pulled the ladder up behind us. We forget that for the majority of the US population, we are a nation of immigrants.
There's a sense in which I earlier in the conversation misdirected the conversation. You wanted to talk a little bit more, I feel, about the idea of the American dream going up in smoke and what that meant. And I feel like I kind of redirected it back towards talking about the breakdown of family systems, mea culpa. However, I do think that
there a parallel process there?
Exactly. That the American dream is a very individualistic dream, right? And it is that individuals who work hard get ahead in life and live fulfilling lives. And I no, they don't. Not necessarily. I mean, they can, but not necessarily. And indeed, the individuation that takes place in the film is not a good thing. Or is it? Because again, I think the film leaves open this idea of the possibility of developing a new, more authentic community than we see in, say, the family circle, or the bullshit of people who show up late as power moves, or mothers-in-law who refuse to get in the car when it's driven by a woman.
Yeah, we didn't even get into that one.
but is there a sense in which that new and better community is sort of birthed in, well, three moments in the film? One, Sam and Michael. After Michael tells him what he's done, Sam's compassion towards Michael, his father's compassion towards Michael, and then Michael passing on the story to his son. Because I think the kingdom of God is entirely uninstitutional. There's no institution in the kingdom of God. it's an entirely anarcho-theocratic state. Well, it's not a state. And yet, so what that means is that when we dream of the kingdom of God, we're dreaming of a community that is one big Thanksgiving dinner without the need for a family circle.
Yeah. Or I always envision the telling stories around the campfire at night. That's my image of telling stories.
This is entirely tangential. All right, dear listener, I'm a Catholic, and as a Catholic, I have a very high view of the Blessed Mother. And I once was in prison ministry, and we were celebrating one of the feasts of the Blessed Mother. I don't remember what it was, but somebody asked, "What do you think happened to Blessed Mother after she came into John's house because she's nothing really said about her after that?" And then, of course, we have legends like the Ascension and that sort of, or not the Ascension, the Assumption and that sort of thing. But I always imagine that she was sitting up in an upper room somewhere in Jerusalem telling stories. Just became an old lady who would just kind of tell stories.
I like that. I like that a lot. Andrew, what movie are we going to talk about next?
Okay, we're actually. Oh, this is great. This is one of Gail's requests. We're going to do Dogma.
Woo! That'll be fun.
That is the perfect film for this podcast.
Yes. So, well, dear listener, we are so excited and glad that you could join us in these conversations. We hope that we are a place where we can gather around as a community and tell stories with one another and to share faith and make meaning in these new media as we've explored and talked about today. If you are able to support us in that conversation, if you want to gather in that family funding like they passed around the hat, we sure are grateful for anything that you can give us through our various giving modes, which are now on our website at newfaithnewmedia.net. And so we hope that you can join us. If you wanted to talk about this episode with us, we would love your feedback and your conversations. If you agree or disagree, we are, as much as anything, we love a good conversation. And so we want to interact with you. We want to hear more about what your thoughts are and what draws you into the conversation. So we, again, thank you so much for making this what it is and for being part of our New Faith, New Media family on A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater.
You ended the podcast without me?